Hey internet friends, if you're new here, I just want to go ahead and restate that the goal with my videos isn't to convince you of my personal stance or get you to even vote for a certain politician, but instead give you the tools and, if you, for some reason, needed it, permission to ask questions and draw your own conclusions. Especially during a year as crazy as this one, in which our personal freedoms and liberties hang in the great in-between, waiting to be reclaimed by us or taken by others. Today, we're going to play a game of Connect the Dots, covering a mysterious Rockefeller Foundation document from 10 years ago, outlining the Lockstep plan without falling into the obvious traps laid out in regards to misinformation. Then I'll be moving on to a curious Facebook post by Victorian Premier Dan Andrews from 2017. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with some current Bill Gates shenanigans to ultimately ask the question: do you remember signing up to be a human guinea pig? 10 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation introduced a report called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development that outlined how the world would look in various scenarios, how those scenarios could impact the development of technology, and curiously, one of those scenarios was a global pandemic. Through each of these hypothetical scenarios, the Rockefellers painted 4 different outcomes for the future of the world. One future of a global pandemic was called Lockstep, which they defined as a world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. But it's important to note that the traditional definition of lockstep is a standard method or procedure that is mindlessly adhered to or that minimizes individuality. The Rockefeller hypothetical scenario from 2010 focuses on a H1N1 outbreak, an influenza strain originating from geese, and in this future, a hypothetical future, H1N1 infected 20% of the global population, killing 8 million people in 7 months. The Chinese government's swift lockdown measures and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as hermetic sealing of their border, yielded a favorable outcome, while the United States' initial policy of just discouraging citizens from travel proved too lenient, spreading the virus across the US and abroad. As the pandemic progressed, national leaders took on authoritarian roles under the guise of protecting their citizens, which first started in the form of mandatory face masks and temperature checkpoints at train stations and supermarkets. But the funny part is that even after the pandemic was over, the worldwide authoritarian control remained. At first, citizens willingly gave up their privacy and freedoms in the name of safety and health. They begged for top-down control, and that's exactly what they got in the form of biometric IDs for all citizens and greater oversight of normal everyday activities. Science and innovation became completely controlled by governments. The Lockstep scenario says that by 2025, the people regretted giving up their freedoms and allowing governments so much control and the ability to make choices for them. The final line of this scenario says that the feeling lingered that sooner or later something would inevitably upset the neat order that the world's government had worked so hard to establish. The way that's written, it's as if people in their desire for freedom was the true problem, not the authoritarian desire for control over the masses in the form of medical tyranny. Even though this was published 10 years ago, don't you see a lot of odd parallels to the reality we're living in? It's curious that it was the Rockefeller Foundation who produced this document, since big oil has been big pharma since 1874, all starting with the Rockefeller family and Standard Oil. A man by the name of Devil Bill sired oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, who built Standard Oil. Devil Bill was well known as a bigamist, a con artist, and most notably, a snake oil salesman. At the turn of the century, the Rockefellers funneled $129 million into the creation of the General Education Board, which shaped our current schooling system. So the Rockefellers, along with the Carnegie Foundations, were key in managing schooling specifically for African Americans in the South, using their private wealth to shape race relations. Eventually, the Rockefeller Foundation shaped and funded many aspects of modern medicine. And fun fact, they were a primary financer of an institute that served as the Center for Eugenics Research until 1939. Now, our favorite fact-checking website Snopes has had a complete heyday with this document, this Operation Lockstep, whatever you want to call it. They've completely dismissed this Rockefeller document as an operation manual for the future, pointing to the fact that the Rockefellers highlighted H1N1 as the virus for global pandemic, not corona. So with this straw man argument, there's no way this document was used as a manual to manufacture or manipulate a virus in the news cycle in order to bring about the police state. But do you see what I see? From mandatory masks and temperature checks, from the dynamic between the US and China, to the use of technology to restrict our privacy and movement under the guise of health and safety. All of these things have already come to pass. The future the Rockefellers predicted is now a reality. Speaking of New World Order operation manuals, 1,000,001 coincidences, and a dystopian future that is now a reality, let us turn to Australia, particularly the Victorian Premier Dan Andrews and his absolutely remarkable Nostradamus-like foresight, as he's announced his plans to allow the current state of emergency to extend into mid-September of 2021. I told you last week that in Melbourne, Australia, the Stage 4 lockdown was getting pretty serious. With the release of high-tech surveillance drones to identify individuals outside not wearing masks or properly social distancing, as well as scanning for vehicles in violation of curfew. But what I didn't tell you was the exciting news of what was to come. Because apparently I missed the announcement back in 2017 when Dan Andrews made this Facebook post which announced, "Every baby born in 2020 and 2021 will be invited to be a part of the biggest clinical study in our history. It could be a game changer for fighting disease, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. And it's happening right here in Victoria." His post linked to an article behind a paywall that outlined Project Gen V, which aims to track the lives of babies from the time they're born until their old age, to identify causes of disease and complete interventional trials and prevention of disease. And guess what? Along the way, they're creating a huge database, specifically of babies born in Victoria between 2020 and 2021. As a side note, if you're an expecting mom in Victoria right now, I did some digging for you, and it appears you can opt out of this program, but you must articulate it. You must say no, you must say you want to opt out, so keep that in mind. Anyway, Dan Andrews, with his extended powers of lockdown until 2021, turning Australia into a prison once again with surveillance and destruction of personal freedoms and liberties before your newborn baby's foot ever touches the earth, stated all of this back in 2017, much like how the Rockefellers outlined Lockstep back in 2010. The irony now is, of course, Australians under Stage 4 lockdown, if they want to make their voice heard, well, that's too bad. You're not allowed to leave your house because you might infect someone. What are you, selfish? How many times have you heard that one, by the way? Not only that, how effective would a citizen uprising be when citizens are so outgunned? Given that between October 1996 and September 1997, Australia responded to its own gun violence problem by collecting roughly 650,000 privately held guns. It was one of the largest mandatory gun buyback programs in recent history. Now, a person must have a firearm license to possess or use a firearm. License holders must demonstrate a genuine reason that does not include self-defense for holding a firearm license. So I have a question for you. Why Australia? Is it just reverting to its original use, a prison? I've said this in previous videos, there's one guy who represents the continuum of Rockefeller medicine, or the continuum of their long-established formula of problem, reaction, and solution with a little dash of eugenics thrown in. Just exchange big oil for big tech, and that's Bill Gates. Much like the Rockefeller Foundation, over the last decade, the very visible Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been warning about a pandemic that would wipe out a large percentage of the population. Back in 2018, Bill Gates ran a pandemic virus simulation which he projected would kill 33 million people if that simulation came to fruition. A year later, alongside the Johns Hopkins Center, the Gates Foundation hosted Event 201 at the World Economic Forum in October of 2019. Event 201 was a high-level pandemic exercise that basically played out a pandemic with potentially catastrophic consequences, which then became what the Gates Foundation labeled Event 201, requiring cooperation between industries, governments, and key institutions. Coincidentally, or not, occurring at the same time was the 2019 Military World Games, hosting 110 nations and thousands of military members from around the world in none other than Corona Ground Zero, Wuhan, China. How about that timing, occurring, what, a month before Corona Patient Zero was reported? How about that spot-on clairvoyance? Does Event 201 sound a little familiar? Like Rockefeller's Lockstep? On February 28, 2020, Bill Gates called corona the once-in-a-century pathogen we've all been worried about as he sounded the alarm for world leaders to respond accordingly and lock down the economy. And remember, at the beginning of all this, they kept just saying, 2 more weeks, just give us 2 more weeks. And now they've totally abandoned the discussion of when all of this will end. Throughout 2020, who's been the spokesperson for corona and her medical tyranny? Bill Gates. Not only the spokesperson, but the champion for a cure in the form of a vaccine. One in which he and the rest of the corona ringleaders are financially invested. And the reason why you'll never hear any negative press about him from legacy media is because he literally bankrolls the news. A recent examination of the charitable grants that the Gates Foundation had made through the end of June found more than $250 million going towards journalism. And the recipients included the BBC, NBC, Al Jazeera, ProPublica, National Journal, The Guardian, Univision, Medium, The Financial Times, and The Atlantic. PolitiFact and USA Today, which are run by institutions which have received funds from the Gates Foundation, have even used their fact-checking platforms to defend Gates from false conspiracy theories and misinformation, like the idea that the foundation has financial investments in companies developing COVID vaccines and therapies. In fact, the Gates Foundation's website and most recent tax forms clearly show investments in vaccine companies. So Bill Gates has a lot of extracurricular activities I could cover, like his focus on what he claims is the #1 killer in the world, mosquitoes, and now he's found a way to genetically modify the #1 killer in the world and release 750,000 of them in Florida with the stated purpose of decimating the mosquito population, which he recently announced through his feel-good YouTube video only a few weeks ago. Apparently, now he has his sights set on building nuclear power plants to fight climate change. I could go on endlessly about Bill Gates, about how and why he could possibly have the authority to dictate public health policy, to experiment on the population with only praise from the media. But I'm not going to, because all that really matters are these questions. When did you sign up to be a human guinea pig? When did you sign up your children to become lab rats? Odds are you never did, yet here we are, and something has got to change. Authoritarian governments and these philanthropic organizations will kill a lot more people than they ever pretended to protect. And 10 years ago, they predicted that the general populace would ask for government protection. Beg for it, even. Will you beg for their protection? Or will you see through this grand illusion before it's too late?